Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're putting on our legal detective hats to unpack the fascinating process of figuring out what ambiguous laws actually mean. You see, when lawmakers pass a statute, they try to be as precise as possible. But human language is imperfect, society is constantly evolving, and unforeseen situations inevitably pop up that the original authors of a law probably never even imagined. So, let's dive right into this foundational dilemma. What exactly is a judge supposed to do when the literal words of a law are vague, contradictory, or straight up confusing? When real people bring their disputes to court, a judge can't just throw their hands up and say the law is too hard to understand. They're required to make a decision. And to do that, they need a very specific set of rules. To figure out those rules, we're grounding our entire analysis in Chapter 1 of Judge Noli C. Diaz's textbook on statutory construction. We're going to look closely at these preliminary considerations to truly grasp how courts decipher legislative intent. Basically, this chapter sets the stage for absolutely everything that follows in legal interpretation. Here's our roadmap for today. We'll start by defining statutory construction, then compare construction versus interpretation, look at who actually interprets the law, when courts must intervene, the rule of clear laws, and finally, we'll wrap up with a real-world case study on ledo corpus. All right, let's jump into part 1. Defining statutory construction, the art of discovery. According to Black's Law Dictionary and Justice Martin, statutory construction isn't just about reading words on a page. It's the art or process of discovering and expounding the true intent of the lawmakers when a law's application is doubtful. That phrase right there, intention of the authors, that is literally the beating heart of this entire subject. The court isn't trying to inject its own meaning into the law. It's strictly trying to uncover what the legislature originally meant to achieve. Moving on to part 2, construction versus interpretation, tools of the trade. You've probably heard people say a judge is interpreting a law, right? Well, in the legal world, there's a vital technical distinction we need to make. Interpretation actually stops at the borders of the text itself. It's limited strictly to the text. Construction, on the other hand, requires our legal detective to look at outside clues, extrinsic aids beyond the direct expression of the text, like legislative debates or historical context, to really solve the mystery. Next up, part 3. Who interprets the law? The situs of power. So, we've got the tools, but who actually gets to wield them? Thanks to the constitutional principle of checks and balances, the situs, or site, of this power rests exclusively with the judicial branch. The legislative department makes the laws, the executive department executes them, but when a dispute arises over what those laws actually mean, the judicial department is the sole authority to step in and interpret them. Which brings us to part 4, when courts must intervene, the requisites. Now, judges can't just go around interpreting laws on a whim. There are strict triggers. First, there absolutely must be an actual case or controversy, a real-world dispute between parties. And second, there has to be actual ambiguity in the law involved. Courts don't give advisory opinions on hypothetical scenarios, and they definitely don't just fix poorly written laws for the fun of it. But what really counts as ambiguous? Basically, ambiguity exists if reasonable people can read the exact same written instrument and walk away with entirely different understandings of what it says. If an expression is doubtful, has a double meaning, or is just completely uncertain, that is the exact moment the court is required to step in. All right, part 5, the rule of clear laws, when the detective steps back. This is where things get really interesting. What happens when the law is perfectly clear? The rule of verba legis kicks in. If the law is unequivocal, the court has no alternative but to apply it, period. It all boils down to that famous Latin maxim, dura lex sed lex. The law may be harsh, but it is the law. No detective work needed, and no rewriting it just because a judge personally dislikes the outcome. To really hammer this home, let's look at part 6, our case study, Ledo Corpus versus People of the Philippines. This incredible 2014 Supreme Court case perfectly demonstrates the friction between a harsh law and the limits of judicial interpretation. Just look at this timeline. Back in 1930, the legislature pegged crime penalties to 1930 property values. Fast forward to 1991, Ledo Corpus fails to remit 98,000 pesos from jewelry sales. By 2014, the Supreme Court is reviewing his conviction. The huge problem here? He was facing an incredibly harsh prison sentence designed for a massive fortune in 1930, not a moderate sum in 1991. Inflation completely changed the value of the money, but the law hadn't changed a bit. Even though the Supreme Court totally recognized how harsh and outdated this penalty was, they stated point blank, the court cannot modify the said range of penalties because that would constitute judicial legislation. Rewriting the law is the legislature's job, not the court's. The penalty scale was written clearly, so there was zero ambiguity for the judges to construct a fairer penalty around. To do so would completely violate the separation of powers we talked about earlier. So I'll leave you with this final thought for today's explainer. If courts are strictly bound to enforce outdated but clearly written laws, how long should society really have to wait for the legislator to catch up? Statutory construction empowers judges to be detectives, sure, but the ultimate responsibility for justice, that still rests squarely on the shoulders of the lawmakers we elect. Thanks for joining me for this deep dive into Chapter 1. Hopefully you'll start looking at the laws around you with a completely new perspective.